I want you to go back to the early 90s and imagine a console that was ahead of its time. It was a system promising groundbreaking graphics, multimedia capabilities, and a vision to change the gaming landscape forever. In 1993, this was the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, aiming to revolutionize the video game industry with its open architecture and high-end technical specifications. But despite all of its innovation, the system never quite found its place in a crowded gaming market. Today we're going to look at the history of the 3DO, what made it stand out, and ultimately why it couldn't compete with other consoles of its time. So buckle up and let's take a trip through the high ambitions and hard realities of the 3DO on today's trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello, and welcome to the 214th episode of our video game history podcast, A Trip Down Memory Card Lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it all to life. We often talk about the companies that bring everything together, making our happy video games a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Today, we'll be talking about the 3DO Interactive Multiplayer, the first version of which was released by Panasonic on October 4th, 1993. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who also has a vision to revolutionize gaming by somehow making every console use the same controller. He's my brother, Rob Casson. So, Rob, what was the main idea behind this universal controller plan, and how did it all turn out?
Well, the plan was to have a controller that worked with all the consoles. Uh, and as it turns out, it doesn't work so well.
No, people don't like one controller for everything.
Well, when you have a circle and a square and a letter and a color, multiple colors really to try and match all them, it gets really confusing. And for some reason, the one button pressed like 7 on some of the consoles. We couldn't really figure it out. We don't know what's going on.
One button press 7?
Yeah. It kind
That's
of just did some weird stuff.
that's unfortunate.
Well, hey, sometimes that's just the way the cookie crumbles, Dave.
That is indeed the way the cookie crumbles. So today we're talking about the 3DO. Do you have any familiarity with the 3DO?
He was in that Star Wars movie, right?
Yes, he was. Other than him acting in a movie at some point in his career, have you ever heard about it otherwise?
Probably just from this podcast, Dave.
No, don't know anyone that's ever had it, played it, fond of it, not fond of it.
Oh, no, I don't know a
Yeah,
damn person.
yeah, ain't that the truth? All right, well, then we have a whole story to tell you, don't we?
That you
But
do?
but before that, why don't you share with our listeners what else has happened during the current week in gaming history?
Well, on October 3rd, 1989, Broderbund released Prince of Persia for the Apple II, a game that would become a landmark in the platforming genre. Developed by Jordan Mechner, Prince of Persia was revolutionary for its fluid character animation, achieved through the technique of rotoscoping, where live action footage was traced to create realistic movement. The game follows the story of an unnamed protagonist referred to as the Prince, who must navigate treacherous traps and defeat enemies to rescue a princess from the evil Jafar within a strict time limit of 60 minutes. Prince of Persia was raised for its challenging gameplay, innovative graphics, and cinematic quality, and it went on to be ported to numerous platforms, becoming a classic and spawning a highly successful franchise. And we learned about it back in episode 58, so go check it out if you'd like to learn more.
We did learn about it. All that rotoscoping, that was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, no, I definitely was, and it kind of just leads to how things are done now. You think of animations nowadays, and they're using movement capture to do a lot of the animation movements, and
Yes, and
that's kind of an
it,
early version of that.
it very much is an early version of that when they were still learning how to do animation on PCs, for sure.
So pretty cool. Go check it out.
Yep.
On September 29th, 1999, Take Two Interactive acquired DMA Design, the Scottish video game developer best known at the time for creating the Grand Theft Auto series. This acquisition would prove to be a pivotal moment in gaming history, as DMA Design, later renamed Rockstar North, went on to develop Grand Theft Auto 3 under Take Two's publishing arm, Rockstar Games. GTA 3 would revolutionize the gaming industry with its open world gameplay and narrative depth, setting the stage for the Grand Theft Auto series to become one of the most successful and influential franchises in video game history. The acquisition marked the beginning of a new era for DMA Design, establishing Rockstar North as a key player in the gaming industry under the Rockstar brand. Also on September 29th, 1999, Activision released Tony Hawk's Pro Skater for the PlayStation, a game that would go on to revolutionize the sports genre in video gaming. Featuring real life professional skateboarder Tony Hawk, the game allowed players to perform tricks and stunts in a variety of skate parks, combining intuitive controls with a thrilling sense of speed and flow. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was praised for its groundbreaking gameplay, stylish graphics, and a memorable soundtrack that captured the culture of skateboarding. The game became an instant hit, spawning a successful franchise and leaving an enduring legacy as one of the most influential and beloved sports games of all time. We learned all about the creation of the game back in episode 161, so go check it out if you'd like to learn more and know what the hell Bruce Willis has to do with any of this.
I was about to ask you if you remember what our favorite thing about that story was.
Well, I answered that one pretty quick, didn't I,
You
Dave?
sure did. It's fun to me when you like retain things like that because that's the fun stuff to tell in this week after week.
And if you're curious what Dave and I are talking about, we'll go look it up. You can either go listen to our episode or go look up what the hell Bruce Willis has to do Tony Hawk's Pro Skater if you don't want to listen to a podcast. But then
That's
why are
right.
you here?
Why are you here?
On September 30th, 1993, Cyan Worlds and Broderbund released Myst for the Macintosh, a game that would become one of the most iconic and best-selling titles of the 1990s. Myst is a graphic adventure game that transported players to a mysterious and immersive world filled with intricate puzzles and an intriguing storyline. The game stood out for its stunning pre rendered graphics, atmospheric sound design, and non linear exploration, allowing players to uncover the story at their own pace. Myst was groundbreaking in its use of CD ROM technology, pushing the boundaries of what video games could achieve in terms of visual and auditory storytelling. The game's success led to numerous ports, sequels, and adaptations, solidifying its legacy as a landmark in the adventure genre and in video game history as a whole. And we learned all about this game in episode 160, so go check it out if you want to learn more.
Yes, indeed. Go check it out.
And last up for this week in gaming history, on October 2nd, 2006, Electronic Arts, or EA, completed its acquisition of Digital Illusions Creative Entertainment, also known as DICE, the Swedish game development studio best known for creating the Battlefield series.
Woo!
Absolutely woo indeed.
We're all big fans here.
The acquisition allowed EA to strengthen its portfolio of first person shooters and gain full control over one of the most successful and innovative studios in the genre. DICE had already established a strong reputation with titles like Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield 2, and the acquisition paved the way for the continued development of the Battlefield franchise under EA's banner. This move also helped EA expand its influence in the global gaming market, ensuring that DICE's talent and expertise would continue to some of the biggest titles in the industry for years to come.
Years upon years, still going.
Yes, it is. And still that franchise is just, just kicking it. They
Still
had
kicking it.
a couple flops, but they've come back. That's gonna happen with any franchise, really. Name one franchise that's been just bangers every time.
Nope, none.
Now there's gonna be some comments that are gonna call us out, Dave.
Yeah, I know. I know. I'm counting on it. We got to spark controversy to get people to interact with us. So there you go. No franchise has ever done banger after banger after banger ever in the course of history. I'm gonna let that sink in for a second. Okay, that
Yeah.
was a second. Rob, if you'll recall, we learned about the early history of electronic arts and its founder, Trip Hawkins, way back in episode 92, when we looked back at the story of John Madden football. So, for anyone wanting to know the whole story in detail, go back and give that a listen. But some of the fun stuff includes the fact that Trip Hawkins was a fan of pen and paper sport games that use like dice and statistics. He unsuccessfully tried to knock off a popular one, eventually came to the conclusion that he could create the same game digitally, which would prevent him from having to do all the difficult math in his head because the computer could do the complex math. And then he went away to college and got his college to design an undergraduate degree around game theory. He literally designs one of the earliest game theory majors in the nation. After he did that, he ended up going to work for Apple until he finally came to the decision that, maybe computers have been around enough that video game design is a viable career. So he left Apple and he founded Electronic Arts in 1982. And he grew it into one of the biggest video game publishers, definitely back when, and arguably now. Success that has obviously carried into the modern age of gaming. Now, we all might argue whether or not it's the devil or not, but you can't argue with the fact that it is one of the biggest in the world.
Right.
Oh, and to make his little to top it off, he did get to make his little digital football game. We call it John Madden football. No, nobody really knows it. Nobody plays it. Not a big deal, Rob. So
No, not one at all.
throughout the 80s, Electronic Arts found great success under Hawkins' leadership. But Tripp wanted to try something new, and he was very curious with looking beyond the software market. And basically, what he was interested in was moving into the hardware business. But hardware was not in the cards for Electronic Arts. It wasn't remotely part of their business plan. And to be fair, I don't believe he ever attempted to make it part of their business plan. So in 1991, Trip Hawkins stepped down as the CEO of Electronic Arts. Now, I will add that even though he stepped down as CEO, he stayed on as chair of the board until 94. So he basically stayed an active participant in the company, but stepped away from the day to day operations of the company when he stepped down as CEO. On September 12th, 1991, he founded the 3DO company. And that's 3D and then zero. We call it 3DO. So the company's plan was to create a next generation CD based video game slash entertainment standard, which would be manufactured by various partners and licensees. So this is all very, very significant and unique to the period in which it's all happening. So let's talk about that first, Rob. So this is 1991, right? End of 1991. 1991 is the year that, for instance, a lot of publications gave the Game of the Year award to Sonic the Hedgehog. Arcades were still a thing. In fact, the highest grossing arcade game was Street Fighter 2, which was huge. The best-selling console for 1991 was the Game Boy, followed by the Super NES. So we're right in that period when handheld gaming was blowing up and the Super Nintendo was blowing up, right? after the Super Nintendo, in case you're curious, like the Nintendo was the next popular one, then the Genesis, and then fifth on the list was IBM PCs. So PC computing still not a huge thing in 1991. But what we've learned in previous episodes is that CD-ROM drives were just becoming adapted in the early 90s, and they weren't widely adapted until the release of Myst, which happened in 1993, right? Because Myst and The Seventh Guest were incredibly popular video games and are the two games said to have single-handedly boosted CD-ROM adaptation into PCs. So in 1991, when he comes in and says, I'm creating a console for this concept, we are squarely in the fourth generation of consoles, still in the 16-bit era and still cartridge based. And good old Trip here has a vision, right, to bring to the world the next generation of consoles. He wants it to be 32-bit. He wants it to be CD-ROM based. Frankly, these are two things the world had not yet seen in any video game consoles. But what's so unique about the 3DO company and the business plan here is that 3DO wasn't interested in manufacturing the console themselves. And I don't mean like they wanted to make the console but go have another manufacturer make it. It's not like where we talked about, how SNES went to Sony to make the SNES CD, but it was still going to be the Nintendo SNES CD, right?
Right.
It's not like that. What they wanted to do was they wanted to create a standard, like a platform on which the consoles were created, and license that platform out to other companies. So this would be like, for example, Microsoft, for instance, being like, the Xbox isn't a console, it's a concept, it's a platform. And they license the technology behind the Xbox, what it uses on the inside, how it interacts with software controllers, so on and so forth, to to its competitors, to another company. So we're going to license this technology out to you, and you can make your own consoles. The best way to think about it, Rob, because there is not another example realistically that we have to go on, think about how DVD, Blu-ray, CD players work, right? There is a DVD standard, and all the different manufacturers, be it Sony, Panasonic, or Samsung, they all make a DVD player, correct?
Right.
And that was how the 3DO platform was going to work. It was going to be a platform, but they were going to make it a standard so all these different manufacturers could make a platform that played 3DO games. So you could essentially, going back to our example, you could essentially have Microsoft licensing out the Xbox to, say, Sony, and then you could have a Sony Xbox or a Nintendo Xbox that would also play Xbox games. And that is basically what the 3DO was. It was a standard that was created of a 32-bit console, a next gen console. Does that make sense?
I kind of think it does. It's still a little bit complicated, but I think I get it.
So Hawkins really believed that the 3DO could be a dominant standard, similar to how VHS took over the helm from competing technologies, like Betamax and VHS went head to head and VHS won. He saw the 3DO as being the a standard platform that everyone would want to jump on, and therefore when other companies brought fifth generation consoles to market, if they chose not to get onto 3D, they would lose to this because it was the standard by which everyone else was jumping on. They would just win by merit of just mass production, so to speak. And he also believed that he was bringing competition to the market by allowing more companies to compete with one another by promoting a common standard, right? Because that's not how the current video game market worked now or back then. Nintendo is only Nintendo, and you can't play Xbox games on a Nintendo, and you can't play PlayStation games on an Xbox. That's how the market works now, right?
Yeah.
But if you have three different versions of the Xbox made by three different companies, they're going to compete in price, and they're going to compete in other ways like peripheral software, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a competitive market is going to drive, free market costs down so to speak. That was his vision.
It makes sense in theory.
Other claims that Hawkins made about his format was that the console was HDTV capable, probably could, and that companies could use this technology as a set-top box. So, like a cable company could use it as a set-top box. So theoretically, it could be a cable box, a CD-ROM player, a video game console, all in one. And they were really kind of hoping to see this technology used in a way to produce digital interactive services, cable broadcasts, for instance, that were um, accompanied by digital information. So they reached out to companies, right? They wanted to get everyone on board. Companies like Panasonic, GoldStar, Samsung, and even AT&T signed up to license this new technology. They had companies on board.
Hmm.
Now, beyond the hardware, of course, we have to talk about the software, right? Because that's one way that these companies make money. And the 3DO company appealed to software developers by offering them an incredibly low royalty rate, which at the time was $3 per game. And that was significantly lower than what either Nintendo or Sega was offering. I think they were double digits, if I'm not mistaken. Or at the very least, let's say double, because 7 and 11 are two numbers that come into my head.
You
And I should have looked it
just
up,
want
but
a
I
Slurpee.
didn't. I know, I want a Slurpee. So they wanted to appeal to video game developers by making it really cheap to to license software. That way, the developers could charge the same and bring more money in, right?
Right.
So 3DO forms, outlines their idea for a next gen console, and begins to shop it around to pretty much every electronics manufacturer. Like I said, of course, they have their eyes set on the big dogs, right? Sony and Panasonic, those are your big guys. Unfortunately for them, as we know now, Sony had already started development on the SNES CD. I mean, the Sony PlayStation. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out our PlayStation episode. We know that at one point they were in talks with Sega to become involved. So Sega was going to make a 3DO console, but Sega ultimately passed due to concerns over the cost of the consoles, foreshadowing. And so other hardware companies did, like I said, did obtain a license. The GoldStar, the Samsung, the AT&T, Toshiba bought a license to join the 3DO platform. AT&T went as far to build prototype units of a 3DO, their own 3DO console, and they showed them off at the 1994 Consumer Electronics Show, oddly enough. So there is a AT&T console out there somewhere.
Wow, that's interesting.
Little fun little trivia fact, huh?
I wonder if it's actually worth anything, or if it's just something that someone will be like, "Oh, cool," and then walk away.
Well, they only made prototypes. They never brought it to market. So
I mean, still, prototyping would be worth something.
prototypes are definitely worth something if you can ever get your hands on it. Like the SNES CD, the actual branded SNES CD, like there's literally, I think, only 2 of them in the world. So very valuable.
Damn.
In all honesty, the timing of the 3DO platform was great for the other reason too. Like I said, this is about the time that CD-ROMs were becoming popular in computers. So there was a multimedia revolution of sorts happening. If you were a computer gamer at this time, or not even a computer gamer, let's say computer user, there was this big push because CD-ROMs music was just becoming a thing, and so was interactive multimedia. I remember early on, to put in an example, that we got Britannica Encyclopedia on CD, and I can't even tell you how much that blew our mind when it first came out. I mean, nowadays there's nothing to compare it to, right? Back then, I had an encyclopedia collection that I used to use for my book reports. That was an entire bookcase. It's probably still in the house somewhere. No, it's not in the house anymore, is it? They took all the shelves out of the family room, didn't they?
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
I don't know.
All right. Anyway, suddenly you had that entire bookshelf of books on a CD-ROM, and not only was it a CD-ROM, but it was interactive multimedia, right? So there was sound bites, there were pictures, there was video. My God, to be able to flip open an encyclopedia and see a video of I don't know, an elephant moving as opposed to just a still picture. I mean, literally mind blown. It's the kind of thing that we take for granted nowadays because this type of information is so readily available. But this multimedia revolution, thanks to CD-ROMs, was absolutely one of the early ways the information age was starting to come to fruition. Basically, the information age that we're in right now. So, and 3DO was really they were really they were a next gen console, and they were pushing the fact that their technology was going to be above and beyond, and multimedia capabilities was part of that. So they were really pushing the fact that, hey, we have this cutting edge technology, and you can do all these really cool multimedia things on our platform as well. So they were getting hype from the news that was reporting about the multimedia revolution and writing on that. So the hype engine was real. I mean, this was going to be like the first fifth gen console, so to speak, and the first CD-ROM console. And it was supposed to bring us a technology that was so above and beyond the SNES. It was going to be mind blowing, and it was riding the multimedia wave. Like, I remember the 3DO, and it was literally revolutionary. It was revolutionary for sure. So, the hype engine was real. So you have all these companies jumping on board the 3DO platform, announcing they're on board, showing off prototypes. Like AT&T shows up. But in all reality, Panasonic was the company that picked up the torch before anyone else, and they brought what was called the Panasonic FZ1 to market on October 4th, 1993. Hence why we're here this week. The launch was not without some issues, though, which is probably a lot of why you don't know about the 3DO. So let's talk about it for starters. So the 3DO company kept making changes to its hardware console that, like, almost up to the release date. So all these software developers kept having to stop what they were doing and adjust their software for these hardware changes because the hardware kept changing. I mean, literally, the reports are up until the release date, right?
Right.
So because of this, when the game launched on October 4th, there was literally only one game available for it, and that was the game that was packed in with the console. Can you imagine, Rob, just for 1 second, because this is hard for me? Can you imagine buying a new console and there being literally no games to purchase for it?
Yeah, I can.
When else has that happened?
Well, you're saying like literally no games, right?
Literally, the only
Okay, that's fair.
the only game that you could play when it first came out was the game that was included with the console.
I mean, I swear that there was some console that came out that people are saying there was nothing else except for what came with it, but maybe people were exaggerating. I don't.
No, no,
I,
it's possible there are others, but like, I think about all the consoles I bought through the years, Xboxes and Wii. I was in line for the Wii, which probably the last time I actually lined up for one, to be 100% honest with you. But I don't know. I would have been disappointed if I walked up to the Wii and Wii Sports was the only option I had for a game.
oh, for sure, 100%.
And that was literally what happened. It's not even like they were sold out. Literally, there were no other games made for the console. Can you imagine how big of an ask that is for some people too?
Yeah, that's a lot.
And because of all these changes that kept happening, not only that, but Panasonic was not able to manufacture very many of these consoles for the beginning. In fact, on the release day of October 4th, most retail stores received two at best.
Wow.
Can you wrap your head around that?
No,
Can
not at
you
all.
imagine the lines at Best Buy? We have two, and the riots that would have happened?
Oh, 100%. That would have
Two.
been bad.
Two. In fact, one was, most stores got one or two. Two is being generous and probably not very common.
That's insane.
So by mid November, a month and a half roughly in, Panasonic really only sold about 30,000 of these consoles. Now, I will say, because I mentioned a moment ago, this was not the first fifth generation console. It was the third, if I'm not mistaken. There was a Japanese console that came out in earlier, like mid 1993, I think like September, and then one came out in October. The Japanese console is called the FM Towns Marty. We don't have it. It's a Japanese console. It was a 32-bit processor, only had a 16-bit bus. So some people like to argue if it was the first true 32-bit console, but it was the first in the fifth generation of consoles. And then Amiga, which was owned by Commodore, actually came out with something called the CD32 or 32 CD, that they released in Europe, but that was also never brought to the United States. So there were around the globe, there were two other 32-bit consoles that preceded this in the fifth generation, but this was the first fifth generation to come to the United States. And Rob,
Dave.
the suggested retail price, the release price of it, was $699. So let's say $700.
Okay.
And that's the equivalent of $1,524 today.
Jesus Christ.
So let me go back to that question. Can you imagine spending $1,524 on a console that only has a pack-in game and no other options whatsoever?
Not at all. I wouldn't do it.
I wouldn't. I mean, it's hard for me to spend the 500 or 600 on launch day with how many problems and how, the trend of the market to release something and fix it later. Me, I don't even like buying games on launch day because I think it's such a prevalent practice nowadays. So
Yeah, no, I mostly agree. It's very rare that I'll buy a game on launch day, and a lot of the times that I have, it's not gone as well as I would have hoped.
right. It was, to be honest, an incredibly ambitious ask for the common gamer. Rob, though, speaking of ambitious gaming systems, have you ever thought of creating something of your own, like, say, I don't know, maybe a podcast?
I've been thinking about it, but with all the tech stuff, microphone, software, editing, it just sounds like way too much for me.
Well, that's where Zencaster comes in. Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that makes it incredibly easy to record high quality audio and video straight from your web browser. You don't need to worry about complicated setups or technical headaches.
Wait, so I can record a podcast with high quality sound and even 4K video just using my browser? No extra software?
Exactly. And Zencaster doesn't stop there. Their post production tools make you sound like a pro. They automatically remove background noise, level your audio, and clean up any awkward silences or maybe ums or ahs. It's like having an editor right at your fingertips.
That sounds like a dream for someone who just wants to hit record and focus on content. But what about getting the podcast out to the world?
Well, Zencaster's got you covered there too. You can distribute your podcast to all the major platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and others directly from the Zencaster platform. It's never been easier to get your show in front of listeners.
Wow, that sounds really simple. How can our listeners get started?
It's easy. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use the code memory card lane, all one word. You'll get 30% off your first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're starting your first podcast or looking to level up your current one, Zencaster is the tool to make it happen.
Well, Dave, I might just start my podcast after all. Maybe something about console history instead of just gaming. Like, I don't know, start with the 3DO.
Oh, well, go for it. And for our listeners, now's the time to jump into podcasting. Head to zencaster.com/pricing, use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane, and you can get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Go out there and get your voice heard today.
All right. Well, with that, let's get back to talking about the ambitious rise and fall of C3DO.
C3PO. So again, not a great release, not a lot of units, no games, and a ridiculously high price. Other manufacturers eventually brought their own 3DO systems to the market, which were less expensive for sure. GoldStar, for instance, launched their own version at $399. Frankly, by then, Panasonic had realized that people weren't going to pay $700 for a system. So, about 6 months into the release, they had already dropped it to $500. Things did get a little bit better. By the time they released a 3DO platform in Japan in March of 1994, there were a whopping 6 games available for it.
Ooh.
And the Japanese launch went much better. No, that's not really a surprise, right? Because Panasonic is a Japanese company. They had about 70,000 units ship out to 10,000 different stores in Japan. I will say one of the unique things about the 3DO platform was that because it was a platform, really copyright protection wasn't something they focused on, right? Because 3DO as a company wasn't trying to keep anyone from using it. The whole concept was that they wanted everyone to use it, you know? So there wasn't really like region lockouts or anything like that, which meant that it was piracy was a thing, homebrew was a thing, and atypical game developers thrived on the platform. Specifically in Japan, the system best became known as a host for pornographic materials.
Nice.
And it kind of was weaned out of popularity because of it, frankly.
Yeah, understandable.
It had a library by the end. It did last until roughly 1996, so it did have a library. Most of its titles were ports of arcade and PC games. Ended up having a library of about 250 titles, Rob. So by the end, that's not huge, but that's not small by any stretch of the imagination, right?
Yeah.
Um, so for starters, it was a really good platform that people could go and purchase to play PC games because PCs were even more expensive. So you could potentially pick up a 3DO and play games that were PC titles like Alone in the Dark, Myst. We've done episodes on those. We talked about them. Total Eclipse, Need for Speed, for instance. These are games that you could pick up and play on here. Also, this time period coincided with the rise of first person shooters, right? Because Doom was 1993. And so, Doom came out the same year this did. And we know that Doom was the game that really defined the modern first person shooter as a genre, right? That's kind of when we went from the old school to the what we consider to be the now of first person shooters. So the 3DO came out as the first person shooter genre was really growing, like getting its feet underneath itself. So some of the earliest examples of games in that genre, aside from Doom and aside from Wolfenstein 3D, games like Killing Time, games like Paved, games like Escape from Monster Manor, these are all titles that are found on the 3DO. Also, because it was a CD-ROM console, again, trying to ride that multimedia wave. When CD-ROM games first became popular, Myst is a great example. They took the stance of more like interactive movies, right? um, Interactive movies that events would unfold, QuickTime events like correctly timed prompts. Games like Night Trap, which we should do this someday. D, the horror game, Mad Dog McCree, which I had on the computer. I freaking loved Mad Dog McCree. It was a full motion video western, and it was fantastic. Loved me some Mad Dog McCree. So the 3DO had a bevy of full motion had a bevy of full motion, what's the word I'm looking for, video games. I guess it's video games, right? Yeah, sound good.
Yeah, I think so.
And there were games that we all know, Battle Chess, which we talked about in our chess episode. They brought that over to the 3DO. Bust a Move came over to the 3DO. Corpse Killer, Crash and Burn was the pack-in. Crime Patrol, Daedalus Encounter was another full motion, whatchamacallit. Demolition Man had a video game tie-in that was brought to 3DO. Because it was a multimedia console, there were a lot of video game and multimedia tie-ins that people liked. Rob, there was a Drug Wars.
What?
I know, isn't that great? And then you have, FIFA was on there, Family Feud, really, basic games like all of those. There was Hello Kitty titles on it. There was just all sorts of things. It John Madden Football came to it. Jurassic Park Interactive came to it. We talked about that recently. Jurassic Park Interactive was the first title out of Universal Interactive Studios. Do you remember what the second title out of Universal Interactive Studios was?
No, I can't say I do.
God, it was the company that did 3DO titles. They were bought by Universal, and they did that freaking fighting game. What's the fighting game? And that
Street
wasn't
Fighter.
no, that was the fighting game. Crash Bandicoot, Game and Watch, Devil May Cry, System Shock, Five Nights at Freddy's. Was it the company that did System Shock that got the money, or was the company that did Devil May Cry that got the money from a 3DO title? Do you remember? Do you remember? I
No, no,
now
I do
I
not.
now I have to go back and freaking look, and I guess I don't, do I? But it was one of the recent episodes we did. I thought, oh, that's dumb. It was Naughty Dog. Naughty Dog made that before they made Sonic's ass game. They made that fighting game for the 3DO. That was literally where they started. So the guys who made Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah, I didn't. I mean, I vaguely remember now when
Yeah,
you said Sonic's ass,
yeah,
but
it was Crash Bandicoot. So that's what I couldn't remember. So anyway, there were just a lot of there were a lot of um there just was a lot of different things that were brought into the whatchamacallit. Rob, we really got to do a Night Trap episode someday. Night Trap is one of the games that when they went to fight over the concept of obscenity in video games, violence and sexuality and all that in front of Congress, Night Trap was one of the games that was like front and center of that whatchamacallit. So has a little notoriety in video game history. That and Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, which was an adult oriented romantic comedy that's also full motion video.
I'm sure that was fun to do.
Theme Park came out on it. I loved Theme Park. Remember Theme Park?
No, I didn't play Theme Park.
All right, back to the whatchamacallit on hand. So the 3DO had a pretty robust library, 250 games, PC ports, arcade ports. Yeah, PC ports, arcade ports, and just a lot. It fell in at a very unique time. Fell in at a very unique time, but we don't know about it, right? Like, you don't know the 3DO. You don't know anyone that knows the 3DO. There are a lot of, like, we know the Nintendo, we know the Genesis, we know the PlayStation. You might even know the Sega Dreamcast, for instance, that wasn't that successful. So there are a lot of other consoles, in that period that we all still really know. So why not the 3DO? What happened, Rob?
It just didn't work, Dave.
No, it did not work. First of all, let's obviously talk about the price, right? Licensing the hardware makes the cost of manufacturing the system much, much more expensive than its counterpart. And within the next few years, the PlayStation was going to come out, right? 94, end of 94, and then 95 for us. And frankly, it was just way more accessible to most people. And the 3DO didn't really follow the traditional business model for hardware manufacturers, right? Because for the most part, you don't sell consoles to make money. That has never really been the business model. They may try at first, but eventually they cut the cost, they cut the cost, they cut the costs, because the normal business model is that you sell consoles at a loss to make the money on the software. And frankly, this is where 3DO had it all wrong. The companies that licensed the hardware weren't in a position to do that. Panasonic wasn't a software company. They weren't going to become a software company. That just wasn't in the cards for them. So selling the hardware at a loss wasn't an option for them because they had no way of recuperating the losses, right? They had to sell the console at $700 when it first started to get back, all the costs that they put into not developing the system, but bringing it to fruition, right? Because tooling a factory, getting all the pieces together, dealing with the logistics, no matter how you look at it, there are costs associated with that. So you have to sell your consoles at a profit to make up those costs. They didn't have a choice. Otherwise, it's dumb. Dumb business model, right? When GoldStar finally came to market, they tried to bring it back to the usual business model. In December of 1995, GoldStar dropped the price, of their console to 200. which meant they effectively lost $100 on each one sold. But by then, they had made partners and kind of established themselves as a publisher, and there are a bunch of GoldStar published software titles on the 3DO library. Reality is, though, they brought them all to market too late to the party for the 3DO to ever really turn a profit on their 3DO platform. And the 3DO company themselves, frankly, never ever really made money. And as the years went on, their fiscal standing just kind of plummeted. Somewhere in the mix, they decided they were going to make what was next after the 3DO basic platform. They started working on a chip, a peripheral chip called the M2. It was like an add-on, a peripheral chip. It was basically another chip that the manufacturers could add to the current 3DO platform to make it even more powerful. But the process of licensing this out and getting it worked into what little options they had for 3DO consoles on the market was just overly complex and never really came to fruition. So they ended up just selling the technology altogether for Panasonic for $100 million in October of 95. And eventually Panasonic just kind of canceled the M2 project. And pretty much at that point, 3DO is a company, because they're literally called the 3DO company. They tried to convert themselves, Rob, from a hardware company to a third-party developer. It ended up selling off its hardware division to Samsung in 1997 for $20 million. And then they proceeded to publish video games for years. I think their best known series that they ever published was the Small Soldiers series. Did you ever play any of those?
No, but I saw the movie.
Yeah. And they acted as a third party video game publisher for various consoles until they kind of just lost standing and had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in May of 2020. No, 2003. No, 20 there. 2003. 20 years ago. As it was going through that process, fun side note, Trip actually bought some of its remaining intellectual property, some of the games, like maybe even Small Soldiers, but as part of that, he also owns the intellectual property of the 3DO platform itself. So that's a fun little fact. But the reality of the situation is it was too expensive. It had a disastrous launch. And just the idea may sound good about a licensing platform and cheap royalty on games, but it never came to fruition. And frankly, when the Sony PlayStation came out a year later, that was it. That was the death knell for the 3DO. It was less expensive, bigger library, everything that the 3DO wasn't, the PlayStation was, and technologically it was better too. That's the other thing that's the other part that was unfortunate, right? In the early to mid 90s, technology was progressing fast. Fast. I mean, every 3 months it felt like we had a faster processor, higher clock speeds. And then we started going 2 cores, 4 cores. Like we were moving so fast in the early to mid 90s. So that year in between the 3DO and the PlayStation, technologically the 32-bit processors were, I think, double the speed. I literally think the PlayStation is almost double the speed of the 3DO. Let's see how close we are to that. The RISC speed of the CPU in the 3DO is 12.5 megahertz. Sony PlayStation console. And the processor in the first PlayStation was 33 megahertz. So it's even more than double. And there's a year between them, and they're both 32-bit RISC processors. And the PlayStation came out so much less expensive. So not only was technology getting faster, but it was getting more cost effective too. And we've learned that recently when we learned about the making of what computer did we learn about recently? The other console that was the same way. Do you remember? I ask you that and you don't know, and I have no clue either. So it was the 2600. Remember how the first time they thought it was going to be $300 for the chip, and eventually it was $12 for the chip?
Oh, I definitely remember that. I just remember what console it was.
Yeah, the Atari 2600. See,
Oh,
my
yeah.
brain's all over the place. So anyway, just for a whole lot of reasons, the 3DO never came to fruition, and the PlayStation knocked it off, and that's that. That's the story of the 3DO, Rob. I'm going to tell you the hype was real on this one. The hype was so real on this one. We were all so excited for the first, 32-bit console. And technologically, it was supposed to knock the socks off the Super NES, which, to be fair, it did. But it was also $700. you know,
I mean, yeah, that's it's not cheap.
which made it so not accessible to any of us in 1990s. So
Yeah, no.
all right. Well, a whole lot of other things that came into this. You know, it's a fascinating story. It's an extension of Trip Hawkins' story, which, of course, earlier was about the beginnings of EA and John Madden football, which we've done an episode on. And I would encourage you to go check it out. It's a really fascinating episodes, which you can, of course, do so by going to our website, www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people find on our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come talk with Dave and I, a link to our Patreon where you can help support us, get access to ad free and unedited versions of our episodes. And you can find links to our social media where I am on platforms as Rob underscore O underscore Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, ladies and gentlemen, we'll tell you one story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a console, a technology, just something I find relevant to the current week in gaming history. While doing so, we hope to teach you something new about the topic itself, the 3DO in today's instance, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world in its legacy. Each week, when I sit down to research our topics, future topics, current topics, the best part about this is learning new things because I sit down and I go, I didn't know that. I'd like to share that with other people. So it's this fantastic cycle of learning and sharing and learning and teaching and so on and so forth. And in celebration of how great that is, we like to talk about what we take away each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Well, I think for me, the coolest thought, the biggest thing from this 3DO is that the intent was to have it licensed to a bunch of different people. So, like you said, you could effectively have Sony with a console and Nintendo with a console and Atari. Like in our modern day, that's just not really a thing that you think of with games. Like, yeah, they might. Some games are co-released on Sony place on the PlayStation and the Xbox because developers want to get the most out of it, but it's not like it's just not as common to have something like that where everyone can just make their own. And it's kind of a cool thought when you think about it.
It
Like
is. It is
if it could
honestly.
have been done cheaper, if it could have been done with more games available at launch, would it have been successful just based on that fact? That you could have multiple people creating them to try and actually have it be more competitive. It's a lot of what ifs. You know, it's something we talk about all the time is who knows what it could have been if things had just been slightly different. But that's such a really cool thing to me. Just think about that. It's not like, most manufacturers are like, oh, well, I'm going to make something that's only for my console. So if someone wants it, they have to get it. He's like, nah, like, here's my shit. Everyone make it and make it cheap.
That's exactly it. That was literally it. Make my shit and make it cheap. And it's a
Yeah.
smart business idea, right? Because they're not 3DO is not footing the bill for anything. They're literally just a company that made a idea and licensed it out to other companies. So there is no risk for them. Also, there's no financial windfall for them as we found out because they couldn't figure out how to turn it into a profitable business model, but there's no risk for them. So that was cool.
I mean, yeah, I'm surprised that there was no way to have a successful business model out of that, other than like, hey, we get a percentage of every game you sell. Then you just have to have games that would sell. But like, I don't know. Obviously, someone thought of that and it just didn't work for whatever reasons. But
Right.
I don't know. It would have been cool though. It's just one of those thoughts that what if, with the way things are now, what if we could do that? I mean, games are constantly released for multiple consoles and for PC and this and that. So like, what if we had something similar like 3DO now? Would it do well? What if Amazon released a game console and it could play everyone's games? I don't know.
I don't know.
That'll
They
probably
kind
happen,
of
to
they
be
kind
honest.
of they kind of do.
Yeah, no, I know. I know. Well, that's it for me, Dave. What about yourself?
I I remember the 3DO, but I didn't know much about it. I never got to play it. Never really paid much attention to the games on it because by the mid 90s, I was a PC gamer, right? And it was dead. So it was fun getting to reminisce about the hype engine around this and learn about it. I couldn't have even told you that it was just a licensing platform either. So that was something new for me to explore. So lot of really great things in here. New topic, new console for me to explore. Also, I've said it before, but I'm really starting to enjoy. We've been at this a while now, right? 4 years, and I'm really starting to enjoy that. It's like I'm really comfortable in this space more. I mean, obviously we've been doing it a while more so than anything. So like we're talking about this console and him founding it in 1991, and my brain immediately can put in the pieces like, okay, that's the Super Nintendo and Sonic the Hedgehog, and like being able to start finding context because we filled in so many of the gaps for me is starting to. I'm starting to really enjoy that, to be honest with you. So, all
Well,
right.
that's pretty good. It's cool
Well,
when you think about it.
before we take it out of here and look at next week, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
I will just take one quick moment to say thank you so much to everyone for listening. It means the world to us, and we hope you get a little bit of knowledge about things that are really obscure here in America, like the
Yeah,
3DO.
like the 3DO. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the 3D interactive multiplayer. It was a console with high ambitions and groundbreaking ideas, but as we've learned, sometimes being ahead of your time can come with its own set of challenges. From its impressive specs to the way it struggled in a crowded market, the 3DO is indeed a fascinating chapter in gaming history. Next week, though, we're setting sail for the Caribbean as we dive into the world of The Secret of Monkey Island, the game that pretty much redefined the point and click adventure genre. We'll explore its quirky humor, the memorable characters like Guybrush Threepwood, and the creative design team that made Monkey Island a beloved classic. So grab your map, polish your sword fighting insults, and join us next week for another swashbuckling trip down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Do bop, da bop, 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 do what up.
Yeah.